All right, so we've got a great panel ahead of us, especially as a native Clevelander, with sustainability being such a big movement for this city. But for a lot of cities across the U.S., both old infrastructure and new, focusing on some of the ways that we can adopt more efficient home building and city design standards. And for us today, we have an outstanding panel. And at this point, I'd like to pass it over to our esteemed chair, Ms. Erica Young.
Hi. Post-lunch, hello. Okay, that's a little better, at least some laughter. Okay, today we're going to be talking about energy consumption, especially on the subnational level, municipalities, state and provinces, and also some of the hands-on work that's being done to address consumption. So I just want to give a couple of little factoids to give some context to this. Half of the world's population currently lives in an urban area. And just to treat water, the New York Power Authority says that 80% of their electricity is used for the distribution and treatment of water. 40% of total U.S. consumption as of 2012 came from buildings. Of that, of course, 40% global warming gases from buildings. Some of the ways that communities have been trying to address these, since they're on the front line, has been going through district energy programs where they set up energy plans, and Mark and Alexis are going to talk a little bit about that. Also, energy retrofitting, going into communities and retrofitting the buildings, putting in incentives to retrofit buildings, both commercial and residential. One of the big glamorous ones was New York City when they did the Empire State Building, and they retrofitted the entire building. Green roofs and gray water systems. Places like San Francisco have used that for heat, for cooling and energy, and to reduce their cost on water treatment and water transportation cost. So just keeping in mind that the tremendous costs that cities incur, also look at consumers, and especially if you look at affordable housing. A lot of poor families, lower income families, reside in areas where a lot of times the housing stock is older, it's not insulated. So one of the big movements that's happening right now is that some of the organizations doing affordable housing construction are looking to bring in a sustainable development, sustainable design into those buildings. And one of the reasons is to reduce the overall life cycle cost for that building, but it's also to reduce the operation for that building. So for instance, in Philadelphia, 2009, Parkside, they are looking with the affordable housing, Habitat for Humanity redevelopment they did, to see a reduction of about 65% in natural gas and electricity costs for homeowner. That's a huge amount of money for a lower income family. Actually, that's a huge amount of money for anybody. So with having said that, I am now going to turn the floor over. Our first speaker is Mark Winfield. He is Associate Professor of Environmental Studies at York University in Toronto. He's also co-chair of the faculty's Sustainable Energy Initiative. And before that, he was with the Pembina Institute. It's a Canadian nonprofit think tank focused on energy, and also at the Canadian Institute, Director of Research at the Canadian Institute for Environmental Law and Policy. After Mark, we'll have Alexis Abramson. She is Case Western Associate Professor of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering and the Faculty Director of the Great Lakes Energy Initiative. She also spent time as a visiting member overseeing the Emerging Technologies team at the U.S. Department of Energy's Building Technologies Office. So, handing that over to Mark first.
Find the deck here. I don't think the slide deck is in the machine, so I may have to do this manually.
There's a USB in the back.
Is there?
Yeah.
Okay. There. All right. So I'll stall while we're doing this, because I kind of feel like this panel is sort of like, and now for something completely different. Because we're going to change pace a bit and sort of move from the international level to the national and, in fact, the subnational level, if we can get there. And just to provide a little bit of context about this, it's important, especially in the Canadian context, to keep in mind that provincial government, there has been this shift in activity around climate change to the subnational level in Canada, and that partially reflects provinces and municipalities, and that partially reflects the very, very high level of policy autonomy that Canadian provinces have around energy policy, especially electricity policy, and it also reflects the extent to which there's also a great deal of executive level autonomy relative to separated power systems of government, that the executives can mostly do what they want when they want. But a little bit of context is how did we end up with so much of the climate change mitigation conversation ending up at the provincial and municipal level, given that Canada started out relatively strong on the climate change front. We were early signers and ratifiers of the United Nations Framework Climate Change Convention. We signed and ratified the Kyoto Protocol. That included a commitment to a 6% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions relative to 1990 by the first commitment period, which meant 2012. We came close at the federal level at one point to fairly serious action. This was, however, about a decade ago. That we saw an abandonment of a relatively voluntary-based approach to large final emitters, a shift in the federal government's approach from a multilateral approach with the provinces, effectively trying to negotiate with all of them simultaneously, to engaging with them bilaterally and employing the traditional federal instrument of bribery to bring about provincial cooperation with some degree of success. And indeed, very clear indications we're going to move to direct federal regulation of the large final emitters. Indeed, end of 2005, sort of penultimate step towards that was taken when the 6 Kyoto greenhouse gases were added to the list of toxic substances under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. This is somewhat analogous to an endangerment finding under the U.S. Clean Air Act. So the one step away from actual regulation, and indeed, the federal government had actually drafted the regulations and published them in the Canada Gazette to control greenhouse gas emissions from large final emitters. There was then a change in government at the federal level, which took a very different view of climate change than the Kyoto Protocol. And at least initially, it did pursue a strategy of policy convergence with the United States, complete alignment, subject to adjustment to remain consistent. You were us and we were you was essentially supposed to be the policy, which lasted until the current U.S. administration gave some indications it actually intended to do something about large final emitters, at which point we said that we were harmonizing outcomes, not approaches. And indeed, Canada did adopt regulations controlling greenhouse gas emissions eventually from coal-fired power plants. But we've also effectively at the federal level been in a condition of policy abandonment. We withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol, and I think any sort of notion that we were attempting seriously to make progress on climate change mitigation is pretty much out the window. That has led to a situation where policy leadership very definitely shifted to the subnational level, to the provinces and to municipalities. At the provincial level, there were a number of different drivers here. There were elements of some provinces, and one has to remember that the political economy of energy and climate change policy is very different in Canada among different provinces. Some provinces are major energy producers, others are major energy consumers, and that changed the dynamics of the equation in very, very profound ways. In some provinces, there was relatively high levels of political consensus and social consensus in favor of climate change mitigation. Indeed, there are probably political advantages to being seen to run against the federal government on this file. In some cases, there was also a element of regional interest that when the federal government did suggest it might do something, it looked as if it might be something that favored the interests of the oil and gas industry in Western Canada over the manufacturing activity in Ontario. So all of these things sort of drove provincial action, some of which are very significant. Carbon taxes, first in Quebec, and then much more seriously in British Columbia. In Ontario, another fairly comprehensive strategy. The centerpiece so far has been the phase out of coal-fired electricity, which has a very, very significant impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. That was 35 megatons per year of CO2 equivalent. Now that has been partially replaced by gas, so it's not quite that much. But generally regarded as the single most significant thing that's been done in Canada to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Ontario also began to make hints at linkages between land use planning, transportation, energy efficiency, greenhouse gas emissions, although at least initially it was somewhat tenuous, but this made a certain degree of sense. There was a recognition, in fact, the biggest source of greenhouse gas emission growth in Ontario was transportation related. And that was fundamentally being driven by issues of urban form, that basically by urban sprawl around Toronto on the other side of Lake Ontario, and also shifts in the vehicle fleet from smaller, lighter vehicles to heavier vehicles as well. Ontario also adopted, and this is where the regulation part comes in, something called the Green Economy and Green Energy and Green Economy Act in 2009. The centerpiece of that was around renewable energy development and a feed-in tariff system, but there are also some very, very important things done in terms of energy efficiency. And this is quite crucial because people who look at energy efficiency will tell you when you look at the actual results in terms of improvements in efficiency, standards and codes typically account for about 50% of whatever you gain. If you ask the California Energy Commission, how have you reduced electricity demand over the past 35 or 40 years, the answer you get, standards and codes, principally utility programming, a secondary consideration. In Ontario, we built in rolling reviews of the energy efficiency standards in the building code. We also renewed the authority around more general energy efficiency standards for appliances and other things, although we did not do the rolling review. And interestingly, and this one is only just starting to play out, we put in provisions that require municipalities to come up with energy plans for their own operations, which has got them thinking about energy in ways that they have not usually done so. So this has set something in motion which may yet lead to some very interesting outcomes. Ontario and some of the other provinces were also very aggressive participants in what, for lack of a better term, have been described as multilateral subnational initiatives. This is basically the initiatives among provinces and states getting together among themselves, the Western Climate Initiative, what was the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast US, the Midwestern Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Ontario, in particular, partially because its motivation around this was very defensive. It was worried about what the federal government might do. It was very deliberate about engaging in every multilateral conversation it could become part of around greenhouse gas emissions. The intention that it could eventually present the federal government with facts on the ground, as it were, in terms of any regime that it might try and impose on the province. More recently, things have become more complex, although I think remain very, very interesting. Quebec remains the leader around this. There is, I think, a very deep political and social consensus in Quebec around climate change and climate change mitigation. I would not anticipate any significant change in the province's direction, regardless of the outcome of the election in the next few days. Quebec was the only province to proceed under the Western Climate Initiative cap and trade regime. It has just recently issued its second climate change action plan for what would have been the second commitment period under Kyoto Protocol. There is a very, very significant municipal focus in that plan. It very explicitly makes the connections between urban sprawl, transportation patterns, urban form, very strong emphasis on public transit versus automobile transportation, a very significant component around climate change adaptation as well, because what we're starting to see from Canadian municipalities and some provinces is the realization that climate change is already here. and that we're already having to deal with extreme weather events and other things. And so you're getting quite a lot of activity going on around adaptation at the municipal level. Sometimes, in fact, mostly, Quebec is somewhat unusual in that there's a provincial mandate around this. A lot of this, again, has been coming up from the individual municipalities on their own as public health departments and infrastructure departments are sort of thinking about, well, we're going to have to deal with this, and we're going to need a plan. Story in BC, which is one of the other leaders, is somewhat more complicated. There have been changes in leadership at the provincial level, but so far the carbon tax has survived, and the current government seems to be indicating it intends to retain it, not expand it. But given that it's a fairly unique and significant instrument in North America, that's a very important development. BC, like Quebec, like Ontario, has delayed its participation in the Western Climate Initiative, Cap and Trade Initiative. But on the other hand, the BC government set in motion something very important, something called the Local Government Green Communities Statutes Amendment Act. And this set in motion has essentially established a mandate for municipalities to develop community energy and emission plans, so essentially to start thinking about energy consumption patterns and energy generation within the community and its impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Brett Gilmore is going to talk a little bit more about where this has flowed to in terms of this emerging practice of community energy planning among Canadian municipalities, but in many ways this is the point of origin of that notion of municipalities starting to look at their operations and their form through the lens of energy, which is unusual for planners. Ontario is a complex case on this. The coal phase-out has been completed. We no longer burn coal for electricity generation purposes in Ontario, and as of a decade ago, that constituted 25% of the province's electricity output. So this is a very, very significant development. On the other hand, our participation in the Western Climate Initiative has been deferred. There's a very clear statement that we are not going to do carbon pricing, no carbon tax. We have been in retreat, and I'll talk about this in the second panel, it seems, on the green energy initiatives, although the energy efficiency component, the renewable energy part, is in retreat, but the green energy component, the renewable energy development component, the energy efficiency component remains in operation. We just went through the process of revising the province's land use planning policy, something called a provincial policy statement, which municipalities are required to conform with, and indeed provincial agencies are required to conform with as well in making land use and infrastructure decisions. And interestingly, the new PPS includes explicit references to climate change mitigation and adaptation and to facilitating energy development within municipalities. So this is a very interesting development, not as strong as I think some people would have liked to see, but it's beginning to move in the right direction. Interestingly, in Ontario, absent a provincial mandate, municipalities have been proceeding on their own, and in particular through a vehicle called community energy planning. And this has been propelled by a number of different considerations, concerns around climate change, both from a mitigation and adaptation perspective. Energy security considerations have also been an important factor here. And what they're getting at the moment is a very, very diverse range of practices, and Brent's going to talk about this a bit more. In some cases, some municipalities, City of Guelph, which is sort of northeast from here on the sort of other side of Lake Erie, basically, very, very comprehensive plans incorporating electricity and natural gas. So dealing with electricity, space heating, hot water, all of this cooling, all of the different energy consumption components. They haven't built in transportation. In other places, what you get is much more site-specific. The City of Toronto is looking at possibilities for community energy plans at the level of sort of sites and projects, particularly some very large redevelopment projects which are occurring inside the city, and looking at possibilities of district energy and energy efficiency systems. At the moment, the practice around this is very bottom-up. It's individual municipalities working on more or less on their own, with the result that the practice is still very, very fragmented. We're sort of in a stage of discovery about how this works and what can you do and who are the different players, because of course this means facilitating conversations between the local electric utility, the gas distribution utility, the planning department, the transportation departments, the developers, which in itself turns out to be a very, very complicated and challenging undertaking. The province is sort of in a stage of catching up. It's beginning to throw some money in the direction of what it terms municipal energy plans. It has also started to take an interest in what it calls regional electricity planning and siting. That it wants to bring municipalities into the conversation about siting electricity generation facilities. This is partially because we've had some huge social conflicts and political conflicts over facility siting for electricity, particularly natural gas plants and wind turbines. How this will all work in terms of integrating back with the provincial energy planning process, nobody knows. We've already had some interesting conversations where the province has said, we need to build big centralized generating and transmission infrastructure for you, and we've had cities say back, no you don't. We have a community energy plan and we don't need that infrastructure anymore. How that conversation goes remains to be seen. So, just to wrap up, I mean, these initiatives have been driven in part by the lack of leadership at the federal level, or in the case of some provinces, perception of something even worse. There was very, very active initial leadership and multilateral engagement from some provinces. BC, Ontario, Quebec, to some degree Manitoba, Nova Scotia, Saskatchewan initially as well. Note well who's not on that list, and we'll come back to that later, I'm sure. That leadership is waning in varying degrees. The one exception is Quebec, where there seems to be a very, very deep and enduring social consensus around action on climate change. You're seeing very interesting moves in terms of at least providing municipalities with mandates and some funding to do energy planning at their level in British Columbia and Quebec. In Ontario, we're just sort of starting to get there, but this has been a very, very bottom-up exercise. And one of the things that we've been discovering is that energy is a very challenging perspective for municipalities and for the land use planning profession. They've not really thought of the world through the lens of energy. Indeed, I was in a meeting a few months ago with one of the authors of the regional land use and infrastructure plan for the area around what we call the Greater Golden Horseshoe, which is basically Toronto and then around the western end of Lake Ontario to Niagara. And very senior planner who just said to me, energy was simply not a lens through which we looked at that exercise. And there's been very interesting conversations now going on inside the planning profession, trying to think about, well, how do we integrate this lens of energy, and what does that mean in terms of planning practice? And I think I'll leave that question on the table for the discussion.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me to be here, David and Erica. As Erica mentioned, at CASE, I'm the faculty director of the Great Lakes Energy Institute. And I also, as she mentioned, spent 2 years at the Department of Energy as a chief scientist there in the Building Efficiency Program or Building Technologies Office. And so I kind of come with a lens around technology, right? So looking more at technology, I'm going to try and talk a little bit broader than that today. But I sort of feel like I'm here more with my former DOE hat on than I am as a professor at CASE, because I thought that would be more interesting to you. But I'm happy to go in any direction during our discussion. So as Erica mentioned, buildings consume about 40% of our energy in our country. I like to think of that as well, that's 40 quads. We consume about 100 quads of energy in our country, in the US. And I like to think of the 40 quads as being about equivalent to about having another 640 million cars on the road. So this is a lot of energy just from buildings alone. And what's interesting is about a third and a third is from industry and transportation. Transportation obviously referring to the vehicles on the road. Industry referring largely to industrial processes like chemical plants and wastewater treatment. Erica mentioned water treatment being a big piece of that. What's interesting to me is outside of, Mark talked about urban sprawl, right, and we have transportation energy costs as a result of that, but really our our cars, for the most part, the engines inside our cars, particularly if we look at hybrids and capturing energy during our braking, cars are relatively efficient. In terms of the internal combustion engines themselves, we're not going to get much more efficient than that. That doesn't mean efficiencies of cars aren't going to go up. They will, but we're looking more at making cars lighter weight and streamlining them better and what have you. So there's still some work to do with cars, but we're doing a great job improving the efficiency of cars. Industrial processes, the same could be said for that too. Obviously, every penny influences the bottom line of these companies that are making the chemicals or the engineered goods that we use every day. And so even just small savings that they can achieve are important to them. And so energy efficiency has become more and more important to these industrial companies. And so there's been a lot over the last couple decades to focus on how do we improve the energy efficiency of these processes. But in comparison, I just want to emphasize that buildings, we have not seen nearly the kind of progress that we've seen in the other two sectors. Buildings are relatively dumb. They don't have integrated into them very much intelligence, and that in my opinion, we need in order to propel this forward. And there's obviously a lot around outside of intelligence in terms of energy efficiency programs that was mentioned as well to encourage better energy efficiency practices of our country. So if you look at the projection, and this comes from the Energy Information Agency, again focused on the US, you see that 2010 to 2030, right now we're not projecting too much growth in how much energy we're going to use in buildings, the buildings green being residential and yellow being commercial. We do expect some growth on the industrial and transportation side, but again with buildings specifically, not much growth. Some of us might look at that as a big thing, as a good thing, right? At least we're not using more energy. I would argue, though, that this is a huge opportunity here, that we actually don't need to use this much energy to achieve the same level of operation in our buildings, and I'll talk about that in a second. So in fact, at the Department of Energy, while I was there, we did a quantitative analysis, and we kind of said, how much energy could we actually save in buildings and again achieve the same level of operation? And we came up with this goal based on real numbers of we should be able to achieve what's called an economic potential, and I can get into details of what that is if interested, but just keep in mind, just think of it as 50% energy savings in buildings by 2030, okay? And that, again, is based on this quantitative analysis that we did here. I don't want to go into all of the details here, but we looked at all the different factors that make up the energy-consuming devices in buildings, right? From lighting to heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, to cooking and washing and drying and water heating, and all of those things we think of in our commercial and residential buildings. And we looked at over 500 different technologies at various levels of development. So we looked at sort of some that were kind of at the basic research stage, and we looked at some that were in the market, okay? And we looked at two really important factors. We looked at the energy savings potential of these technologies. So let's pretend for a moment I have a magic wand, and tomorrow, or maybe in the year 2030, everybody will now have R10 windows, so highly insulating windows. How much energy savings would that bring to the country? Or we also looked at the costs, but in order to kind of level the playing field of these technologies and look at their costs, how do you compare the cost of a window to, you know, the cost of a new kind of air conditioning system? We look at the cost of the conserved energy from installing these different technologies in the buildings. And that way it kind of levels the playing field. When it's dollars per unit of energy, then we can, again, compare the technologies. And ended up using this analysis at the Department of Energy to help the federal government prioritize where it should be making investments. And I should say that not all of these comparisons that were made were all technologies. Some of them were energy efficiency programs that utilities were running. Okay? Some of them were educational programs, like educating people about how to save energy in their homes or in their office spaces. So we looked at the technologies, but also some of the deployment opportunities. And so one thing to keep in mind, the really tall bar here is business as usual consumption. And that's additive over all those different pieces and parts of the building there. If you look at what is available on the market today that is cost effective, so that means that the cost of the technology you could buy to replace your bad windows or replace your aging heating system or to put LEDs into the light sockets above, that the costs associated with those things are less than the cost of the energy saved. So they're worth the investment to replace those technologies. So we looked at those costs of what's out there today, and that's the second bar there. That's today, with what's on the market, we can actually achieve a reduction of 30%. Now, of course, somehow I have to convince all of you in the audience that you need to go out and buy these cost-effective technologies for your buildings, right? And that's very, very hard to do for various reasons. One, the payback may be 5 to 7 years, and that may be too long for you. Payback could be 15 years if the lifetime of the technology is 20. That's still good, but that capital investment might be too big for you. So there are various reasons why we're not at this 30% lower rate now, but with what's out there today, we could achieve that if we could get people to buy the things that save energy in buildings. At the Department of Energy, our goal then is to achieve that economic potential of 50%, to go from 30% that's today to 50% in 2030. And if any of you have science backgrounds in the audience, you know that we can't get 100%. There's something called the second law of thermodynamics. And so there's just trust me on that, there is a thermodynamic limit, and that's that last column there that basically says, okay, we know we can't get something for nothing, and converting energy actually costs us something. So we also have to look at the boundaries of that. So we're never, if we look at the business as usual consumption on the left and the thermodynamic limit on the right, we're never going to get lower than that thermodynamic limit. And in fact, we think by 2030, getting to 50% reduction when thermodynamic limit's 80% is still a really great achievement. So I just thought I'd mention really quickly, this is the tool that now the Department of Energy's Building Technology Office is using to make decisions about how to invest in building energy efficiency. This comes across, I'll talk about this in a second, but it comes across all the different levels of development, from early stage technology development up into the deployment programs that we have in the residential and commercial sectors, in partnership in many cases with states and municipalities. So just roughly speaking, how this works is we take those 500 plus different technologies or deployment practices, and we calculate the energy saved in the country in a particular year in 2030, and we also take that cost of conserved energy and we put them on a graph that looks like this. So A, B, C, D, and E are just examples of technologies or measures or deployment programs or what have you. And obviously, when you plot these all together, you want to be in that bottom right-hand quadrant, right? You want to have the most amount of energy saved at the lowest cost. So because of this analysis, we are changing the way that at least the Department of Energy is investing in energy efficiency. And this approach is also now being adopted by the different municipalities in different states. They're taking the analysis that we've done and kind of rerunning some numbers based on their region and ending up with a similar kind of analysis themselves to help those areas prioritize in terms of looking at what programs work and what technologies should be invested in. So in the Building Technologies Office, at the Department of Energy, there really is this three-pronged approach, and I think it's really critical, particularly at the federal government level, that there be this three-pronged approach. At the state level, there might be more of a focus on deployment programs, but I wanted to kind of lay this out in that at the federal level, we need to be investing in the research and development of high impact, so big energy savings, low cost technologies. Then we need to make sure that there's some kind of market stimulation out there, helping to accelerate those technologies into the marketplace. And then third, there need to be some kind of regulation, some kind of standards around those technologies. And this really is a sort of virtual circle because we're always coming up with better and better technologies with better performance and lower cost, and again, feeding into the market and eventually reaching into those standards and those codes. And so that's really how, that's that strategy that's used at the federal government to push energy efficiency. So I'll just go over a few of kind of the specifics under these different three strategies. And I think it was Mark that said, you know, a lot of people point to buildings, building codes, for example, as being the thing that's really pushing energy efficiency forward. And I would say, well, okay, that may be the case. Certainly building codes and appliance standards are critical to making things happen. But without the investment in the research and the development piece of it, we'll never be able to get to the point where we have the better technologies, the better widgets, the better buildings that we can then set those standards and codes. So these are just a few examples of some of the investments that have been made recently at DOE. We've got the analysis to show that really I'm sure many of you know about LEDs, right? And the cost of LEDs today have come down significantly. They've really now reached the point where they are cost competitive. You may be scared walking into a Home Depot and have to buy a light bulb for $10 when you're used to buying it for, you know, $1. But in terms of the lifetime, if you do the calculation, the payback is there. So DOE did a lot to help move both the R&D and the market stimulation side of that forward. It's a great, the solid state lighting program has done remarkable things for LEDs in this country. Another example is the heat pump water heater. It's not something that we necessarily are going to have here in Northeast Ohio because it relies on electricity. So in places of the country where electricity is used to heat water, very inefficient to just run a nice resistor through water and heat it that way. Not the best way to heat your water. And so this heat pump technology, which actually has been around since the 70s really, but really needed more investment to get performance up and cost down, was also a big investment for the Department of Energy. And I should say that General Electric is only one of the many companies now selling this kind of technology, but they also opened up a manufacturing plant in Louisville, Kentucky, as a result of the success of this program. So also creating jobs and bringing manufacturing to our country. A couple other things, a neat way to do cooling is another kind of newer investment of the Department of Energy, and also an idea around an integrated heat pump. This gets at things, people always say to me, well, why do I have, you know, my water heater over here and my heating system over here, and you know, why aren't they kind of coupled together? Wouldn't that help not waste so much energy? And the answer is yes, it absolutely would. So this is really, we need some stimulus to make things like this happen in the industry. And so again, that's where the federal government has come to play a role to kind of stimulate some of these technologies forward. So that's prong number one. Prong number two is the market stimulation piece. And really there's kind of two sub-prongs here in that we've got the commercial building market and we've got the residential building market. And there are a variety of different sort of market stimulation programs at the federal level. one sort of this all-encompassing program is called the Better Buildings Program. It's got a couple of different sort of subheadings under it. But this is bringing the Better Buildings Program in the commercial space is bringing together companies, and I'll jump to my next slide here, companies like you would expect that you shop at, I'm assuming, bringing them together. They've got, Home Depot, Target, Walmart, Lowe's, they've all got buildings, commercial buildings across our country, right? And bringing them together really to share information about the technologies, the energy efficient technologies that they're using in their buildings, and to talk really about some of the business models around energy efficiency that they're using. And believe it or not, they do get in a room together and they do share best practices. And it's really been a great program to help market stimulation. And I wanted to give one example of what happened as a result of the Better Buildings Program. And DOE, what we did was identified that something called a rooftop unit, right? This brings in the HVAC, the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning to all of these stores, right? Rooftop units are horribly inefficient, right? And if you ever look at the top of a roof of these stores, you'll see them, these big sort of boxes. They're shown here at the bottom that are providing that HVAC to the building. And usually there are many, many of these sort of spread around the building. And they're not very well sort of connected to each other and not very efficient. And so what the DOE did was we went to our Better Building Alliance, we went to our commercial partners and said, we want to make these better. They said, we want you to make these better, we want to save energy too. And we kind of talked to them about we talked to them about how much energy they were using, and we talked to them about energy savings. And what bang for your buck are you looking for? If these cost twice as much, how much energy would they have to save? And we had these great conversations with them, and then went to the manufacturers of like McQuay and Carrier and talked to them as well. So we're bringing these parties together. And as a result of this rooftop unit challenge, this RTU challenge, we were able to actually result in less than a year an RTU unit that was 50%, it saved 50% of the energy in cooling in particular compared to their predecessors without a significant increase in cost. So that's the commercial side. On the market stimulation side, and Erica mentioned a little bit about this, is a residential program. Again, at the federal level, we're doing a variety of things. This is the Better Buildings Neighborhood Program. And this is where there are a lot of connections with the municipalities. In fact, it was probably about 5 years ago or so when ARA stimulus funding was available to all the municipalities, and they competitively bid for a lot of the ARRA funding. And through this Better Buildings Neighborhood Program, they received that funding. And the goal of this program at the federal level is to really establish in these different parts of the country a self-sustaining energy efficiency retrofit market. And what's key here is that depending on whether or not you're a town in Texas or a town in Maine, the model you might use to retrofit the residences in those towns are going to be different. So the federal government couldn't come and say, here's the model. We work directly with the municipalities to help them identify where the priority areas are. Even human behavior is different in these different parts of the country. And so keeping that in mind, what do these neighborhoods need to stimulate energy efficiency and sustain it in those areas? And so very specific sort of market-driven models were what we were looking for there. There's also an educational opportunity for the federal government to work with the municipalities to do a real educational sort of effort in these different towns, and then also to build a trained workforce. The building managers that are typically out there today have not been trained about energy efficiency, and it is not a priority for them. And so changing the way that we're training our workforce to be conscious of these things. I always say energy efficiency needs to be as easy to do as it is not to do. And so training these building owners to not think of energy efficiency as this cumbersome, difficult thing to address, but seeing how easy it is to incorporate different energy efficiency strategies into the buildings that they manage. So a couple of slides here, one in the state of Washington, and their grant recipient. This is an educational event, and then a Massachusetts grant recipient. This was more of a technology that they were using to go around and document the waste energy in homes and literally tell people that their homes were show people that their homes were wasting energy through these thermal images. And then sort of that last prong, right, this is where the appliance and equipment standards in. DOE actually has, and you guys are the law people, not me, but there's a issue 23 rule that gives DOE the authority to establish appliance standards. So these are for things like refrigerators, dishwashers, washing machines, and that we require the manufacturers of these different appliances to meet certain standards. And those standards change over time. We establish all the test procedures, we enforce compliance with the manufacturers, and as a result of those increasing efficiency standards, our appliances are becoming more and more efficient. And what's interesting is at first when these standards were put in place, they were really concerned about cost skyrocketing. I don't have the graph here, but actually costs in refrigerators especially, even though efficiency has gone up, the costs have gone down. So, and then that other piece of the prong is the National Building Code. We do have a national building code. It's revamped every 3 years, but it is not enforceable. Building code is enforced at the state and the local levels. So what we do now more than we ever did before is take that building code and work with the municipalities and work with the states to help them adopt what we think is the best energy efficiency strategies for the country. And so the resulting impact really is on money saved and on energy saved. And we've got at the Department of Energy, these are some of the goals that are set there in terms of dollars and energy saved. The 30%, not to confuse you, 30% is not economic potential, it's realizable savings, so it's a little bit of a different number that we use. I just want to end by saying that I'm kind of taking a little bit different of a path, but I hope you realize that actually we are at an inflection point right now with energy, that in the way we generate because of distributed generation and the way that we're controlling energy more in a distributed fashion across an energy ecosystem is changing sort of this smart energy, or changing the energy ecosystem that we live in today, and will play a key role in influencing the energy ecosystem of tomorrow. So I will stop there and then take any questions anyone might have.
Okay. Thank you to both of our presenters here today. I had a couple of points and then I want to open it up to the floor, just sort of round up ideas. One that very much came to mind is the chicken and egg. You know, do building codes come first, or does the concept of renewal of energy sustainability and the cost savings from that, does that come first? Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? The other one was the difference in the roles of the federal government and both the U.S. and Canada. And I also was thinking about countries in Europe where a lot of times North America will look and say, well, Germany has this, this, and this, but from an urban planning standpoint, forgetting that countries such as Germany, the Netherlands have national urban planning bodies. So the complication in the US or Canadian system is that far more of our work is done, our policy making is done on a state and local level. So how do we address the issue that Mark brought up about urban planning and looking at sustainability plans as part of our overall comprehensive plans, our municipal plans that we do for cities, so they address things such as climate change and energy. And then finally, the mention of the regional bodies, particularly the binational, and then also there's like C40, which is an international urban planning group of municipalities. What is the real impact that those programs or those institutions and organizations are having on the real policy making that ends up happening at the municipal level in both US and Canada? And then, so that's my question, my final
A lot
question.
of questions.
Sorry, but those are really food for thought. It's really, I'm opening that up to you guys now to say, what questions do you have for our panelists? Yes.
I have a microphone.
Oh, wonderful.
Thanks. A couple years ago, Jeremy Rifkin wrote a book called The Third Industrial Revolution.
Yep.
He talked a lot about distributed energy
Yeah.
systems, and I'm wondering, I think he actually has a new book out, and he was talking about the success of the distributed systems around the world. How much success have you had in the U.S. as a model? Do you see areas where it's working? I don't think we've looked at trying to adopt similar approaches in Canada yet, but I'm wondering if you could speak to success stories in the U.S. in terms of that distributed model where things are more horizontal as opposed to vertical.
Sure, I don't know if these are on, but I'm loud. I think it's on. So you caught me, like, that's my last slide. I just gave a talk on this whole thing last night. Las Vegas, Nevada is probably the closest thing I would point to in the US that's trying to do this, right? They are a unique city for obvious reasons. They've got huge, huge building loads, and to be able to be much better optimized within the city with their energy usage, as well as on the generation side, with more and more renewables cropping up in Las Vegas, and being able to really optimize, especially handling supply and demand when they've got casinos running 24 hours. So that's one model I would point to of something that's happening today. I would say it's very nascent, though. There's still a lot more to do before we really see a sophisticated, well-organized, well-optimized model. But I'll also point out there's been a couple of sort of test places around the U.S. One is in the Pacific Northwest. It's called the GridWise project. And they actually have been looking at not just how to better take the distributed generation and the distributed control and balance those two and optimize a whole process, but how do you get the human involved, right? So I don't recall exactly how they do it, but the human involvement, you can interact with your energy world in a much better way. So right now, if I were hot, there'd be nothing I could do, right? And then the last one I mentioned is Austin, Texas. It's Pecan Street project, where they too are looking at how do we better optimize a system when we've got distributed.
Mark?
Yeah, we're doing a project funded by Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council now on smart grids, and it's been kind of interesting sort of figuring out where that conversation is at, because in Ontario we've now gone through the smart meter phase, and we've deployed smart meters around the province, and so we're now into this next stage in the conversation as to where do we go next. And it's been quite interesting, the sort of range of different demands that come into the conversation, of which intermittent renewables integration is one, load management, demand response, this is all energy geek stuff, but those sorts of things. But there was also some very interesting other thing, and then how will that help us with renewables integration? So far that's happened relatively unspectacularly, in the sense that Ontario is now managing 1,750 megawatts of wind. And you ask the independent electricity system operator, well, how's that going? And their answer is, well, it's fine. We've got it figured out. So we're sort of quietly progressing. There's some other interesting things going on at the boundaries. That part of what's happening is that you're getting new players in, who are actually becoming active in managing energy loads. And with Rogers Cable in Canada, the people who provide cable TV and phones, they're now offering sort of effectively home management systems over your iPhone. And there's this kind of realization going on in the utility world, oh my goodness, they're becoming load managers. They're taking over from roles that we thought we were going to have, and they're operating completely outside of any kind of regulatory framework for that kind of a role. And where that takes us, we don't know. This is sort of what sometimes gets talked about as the Internet of Things, the sort of managing the devices, and then that has a reverse kind of effect on energy consumption, which isn't being thought about by the people who are either managing all those, who are providing either the service or the consumers who are taking advantage of those services in terms of what are you doing in terms of the energy grid and the kind of demand you're putting on it. So this is a very interesting inflection point about the cascades down into questions around viability of traditional utility models and all of these kinds of things that the utility world, which is typically a bit slow, a bit conservative, is sort of struggling to think about how do we deal with this, and how do we deal with possibly new entrants and things like that.
That's interesting, because I mentioned this morning, the Kelso Gray region is looking at doing sort of an energy futures piece, and I see this distributed, energy component within the regional context being an aspect of it, and sort of still trying to figure out how to tackle that potentially in this research study that we do, if we can get it off the ground, so that's useful.
Anyone?
Oh, thank you. What do you think of municipalities or cities that adopt sort of self-imposed challenges? I'm thinking of Vancouver saying it wants to be the greenest city in the world by 2020. First of all, what does that mean? And secondly, how are they going to get there? Maybe Mark can answer that one, but it has a building code aspect as well.
Yeah. Well, the City of Toronto, prior to the current mayor, was very active that way, and indeed one of the advantages of incompetence is that sometimes good things keep happening, even though the leadership isn't there anymore. My experience has been, and there are varying levels of sophistication about this. You look at somewhere like Guelph. They're getting quite seriously into sustainability indicators, which by implication carry with them notion of endpoints in terms of where you're trying to get to in terms of urban form, transportation, modal splits, greenhouse gas emissions per capita, density, diversity of land uses, all kinds of things. So in that sense, it's quite useful, it's interesting. And then what you're also getting is that at least in some places like Toronto, like Guelph, even in other places you'd be surprised at, those plans are starting to get to implementation. They're starting to work their way into actual infrastructure plans and land use plans and zoning bylaws. And at that stage, they start to be quite real. So I think they are helpful, provided council continues its engagement and in effect sort of follows up and says, yes, we actually really meant that. And that we actually expect the commissioners of the different departments to come back to us and say, here's what we're doing on transportation, here's what we're doing on buildings, here's what we're doing on utilities. And if that happens, which has happened in some places, then the results are quite good. Like in Toronto, you can point to, there's both an energy plan and there's also a climate change, both mitigation and adaptation plan. And those are taken very, very seriously inside the city bureaucracy. That people are working on that and can tell you, here is what we are doing in terms of adaptation and so forth. So I think it is useful, provided the political commitment is sustained. That's the crucial piece. Once staff know they've got a mandate and the council's going to stick with it, then I think we are seeing very, very interesting and very, very real results. And the extent to which we're getting anywhere on climate change adaptation in Canada, mostly, it's precisely the result of those sorts of initiatives.
And I'll just add one other thing, completely agree with everything that you said, but the one additional thing I would say is, and this is the engineer in me, is actually through public disclosure laws of data, of energy usage in buildings. So not many people would think like, what could that do for energy efficiency? But it really does two things. So in this country, in the US, most of the country, you do not, right, it's considered private information, the energy use of your building, of your home. And in certain parts of the country, Philadelphia's one, New York's one, there are now these almost the whole state of Florida, there's these new public disclosure laws on the books that are requiring, and it varies to certain degrees, and there's still some privacy issues around that, but to disclose your energy use of your building. And one could argue that, oh, that's peer pressure, and maybe that would help, and that's true. But you'd be surprised. There's this great study to show a utility that tried to get people to change how much energy they were using, and they'd give them rebates, and they do all these things. And the number one thing that worked to cause people to save energy is when they learned that they were using more energy than their neighbor. And that really had a significant effect. So that's one. And then the other thing I would say from the data science and analytics, it's a rich amount of information that we can actually find more correlations, more information in that we can take action on.
There's been some very interesting things going on. Guelph, again, is the leader then doing energy consumption mapping within the municipality. You can actually find the nodes where you've got heavy, intense energy use, which tells you stuff about buildings. It also tells you a potential for district energy systems and all kinds of things. The interesting thing that happened there was it's very hard to get the utility data, partially because they actually have privacy concerns as well. And so they're very hesitant to release the building specific data. In fact, we had our information and privacy commissioner saying, you can't do that without getting the consent of each occupant of the building. Which complicated things a little bit, but they did it, and the results are fascinating in terms of the map, the picture of the community that you then get through that representation.
And I'll just add real quick to that, because I looked a lot at the challenges and the sustainability, did a survey of the sustainability plans around the United States, and very much concur with Mark. What we found was that it really depended on where was it initiated? Was it initiated by a mayor or from the council? And how was it incorporated into their overall comprehensive planning? Because there had to be clear lines of responsibility that would continue regardless of whether there was a change in the political climate that made those challenges, those competitions worthwhile, or those statements worthwhile.
I find it interesting, or maybe ironic, that you use Florida as an example, because I remember living in Miami, and the largest lit-up building in Miami skyline was the Florida Power and Light building that was multicolored, and I always knew where my money was going.
When was that?
A few years ago.
Okay. All right.
But I just always remembered where my power bill was going. But I might be dating myself, but and I appreciate that we have taken such quantum leaps in our technology to make things greener. But I remember years ago, I think it was part of Switzerland, maybe it was in fact Zurich, was actually powered by its trash. It was, it recycled all its trash, and then it burned its trash, and through the heat from the burning of the trash. And I thought to myself, leave it to the Swiss, to do something like that. And it seems like we might have left that behind as part of our technological advance, and it seemed to make sense. It had green elements all around it, but it seems like we've gone, in this quantum step, we've forgotten to take that wagon along with us of good practice. And I just wonder what you think about that, and if that's happening anywhere else, because I would hope it would be, but I don't have a lot of confidence that it is.
So it all comes down to energy density. So I'll get a little technical here, right? Is that you can get energy out of trash, right? But per cubic meter of trash, if you compare the energy you get out of burning that compared to what you can get out of coal, like it's so far apart. Yeah. So that's one of the reasons we can't. We need a lot of energy, and we can't.
But we have a lot of trash.
We have a lot of trash, but I don't know the numbers offhand, but it's a huge, and cost too. So you think trash trash is free, right? But
process it.
But a lot of places actually are doing this
They-
too.
they
City of
are, they
Alexandria, Baltimore.
They
But
are.
there's some real technological limits, which I think that they're
Yeah.
trying to get to.
You also need to be very careful about energy balances.
Yeah.
Because you can recover more energy from some of that trash stream by recycling it
Exactly.
than you can from trying to burn it in a mixed waste stream. Like, you recover huge amounts by recycling paper as opposed to making new paper, so you have to look very carefully. And there ends up being a competition between those who would burn, because they want exactly the same components of the waste stream that are very attractive from a recycling perspective, because they're the bits with all the embedded energy in them. So you should be very, very careful in your analysis in terms of whether you're actually coming out very far ahead. I mean, the Europeans went down that road in part because it was a necessity, that geology was such that particularly the Swedes and the Danes, they're like Newfoundland, they're rock. There's nowhere to have a landfill, and so that's why they went down that path. In North America, we had landfill, but at least where I'm from, we've also embedded now fairly extensive infrastructure for separating the waste stream. In Toronto, we go 7 or 8 different ways in terms of pulling the waste stream apart. So what you're left with residual is probably very low energy content anyway. It's wet and it's very low energy.
Thank you. Go back.
I had a question with respect to essentially large office buildings, urban office buildings, and the landlord-tenant relationship. And I've certainly had it drawn to my attention that that's not something that drives energy efficiency. A longer-term arrangement, the tenant doesn't have much motivation, and maybe the landlord doesn't. Are there some new approaches that are being taken there? Is there any public policy that's driving anything in this area?
Well,
That's presumably a huge area for
This
gains.
is a big issue for commercial office operators. I mean, it's more tension between the owner and the tenant. Because the owner can see a rationale for doing energy efficiency, because that gets the building operating costs down. Where you end up with a fight is whether the tenant should somehow share in that savings somehow. And then it becomes complex technical questions. Then do you bulk meter the building, or do you move to individual metering of the individual units, so that in which case it's easier for the tenant to see the saving, but then the owner doesn't feel he or she's got an incentive to do the building as a whole. So there are mechanisms for sharing the savings and sharing the costs, which can get you past that barrier, but it does require regulatory intervention by most likely states and provinces who regulate landlord-tenant relationships, to sort of say, this is how that transaction is going to work, and how the upfront costs will be managed, and then how the shared savings will be managed at the back end.
Right, so creative leasing options that do exactly that, and I'd probably point to New York City as doing a lot in that area. So if you're interested, look at some of how they're suggesting leases are be drawn up to address what Mark's talking about.
But you leave me with the impression that really this is an area that's only beginning to
I agree, yeah,
Oh, no,
absolutely.
This
Yeah.
is a problem. You know, where you have multi-tenant buildings, this is a big problem. It's a problem. Low-income residential, it's been an issue as well, because we've even had landlords try and up the rent to pay the upfront costs of the renovation,
Right.
and then not passing the savings back to their tenants afterwards.
So split incentives is what they call it, yeah.
Okay, well, I want to thank both Mark and Alexis today for sharing their wisdom with us on sustainability in the subnational level, and with regards to buildings and building technology and municipal urban planning. So if we could.
Thank you.
Thank you very much again for that very enlightening discussion. All right, so we're going to take our final break, and then we will return in about, we actually have about 20 minutes for the last and final panel today. A very exciting discussion on alternative energy. So stick around, more great things to come.